So, before people across the country started hearing about the Jeff Davis 8, this was just Jennings, Louisiana, a small city in Jefferson Davis Parish, tucked into the southwest corner of the state, just right along Interstate 10. At the time, around 10,000 people lived there. It was the kind of place where people knew each other. Word traveled fast, and daily life just kept moving, even when things underneath were starting to fall apart. The interstate brought constant movement through Jennings, bringing in traffic, drugs, as well as people passing in and out. And over time, people around Jennings, including law enforcement, started seeing the area as part of the wider drug trade running along through Interstate 10, through southern Louisiana. And in one part of town especially, a lot of people were already living right on the edge. By the time it was all over, 8 women from Jefferson Davis Parish had been found dead in canals, swamps, drainage ditches, and along back roads around Jennings and nearby Arcadia Parish. And the thing that really stood out was that a lot of them knew each other in one way or another. A lot were struggling with crack addiction, some were involved in survival sex work, and several were moving through the same social circles in South Jennings, crossing paths with the same people, the same streets, and sometimes even the same law enforcement officers. For years after that, people kept arguing about what was really going on there. Some were convinced there had to be a serial killer walking around Jennings. Others thought it was something messier than that. But before all the task force stuff, before the headlines, before the theories started spreading way beyond Louisiana, it was just one body in a canal. And back then, nobody really understood what that one discovery was about to turn into. The story really begins in May 2005. A fisherman near Jennings spotted something floating in a canal on the outskirts of town, often identified in reports as the Grand Marais Canal. At first, he thought it was a mannequin, but it wasn't. The body belonged to 28-year-old Loretta Lane Chasen Lois. By the time she was found on the 20th of May, her remains were so badly decomposed that investigators had to identify her through fingerprints. Loretta was a mother of 2. Media reports later described her as someone who had been struggling with addiction and was involved in survival sex in South Jennings. Almost immediately, investigations was already behind. Her cause of death stayed unclear for years. Some sources said it was undetermined. Others referenced suspected asphyxia, but there were no detailed public autopsy findings that clearly established how she died. The decomposition had already done too much damage, and that uncertainty would sit over the case for a long time. At that point, Loretta's death wasn't being discussed as part of anything larger. There was no Jeff Davis 8, no task force, no national attention. Just another woman from South Jennings found dead under circumstances that nobody was treating as a sign of something bigger. Then, less than a month later, there was another body. On June 18, 2005, 30-year-old Ernestine Marie Daniels Patterson was found in a second canal south of Jennings. Like Loretta, Ernestine was a mother who moved through the same difficult world of drugs, survival sex work, unstable housing, and the constant overlap between vulnerable people, dealers, informants, and local police that defined parts of South Jennings. But unlike Loretta's case, Ernestine's death showed clear signs of violence. Reports describe her throat as having been cut. This time, investigators moved quickly. 2 men, Brian Chad Jones and Lawrence Nixon, were arrested and charged with second-degree murder. For a moment, it looked like this one might actually get resolved, like at least one of these deaths would be answered before it disappeared into the same fog surrounding Loretta. But the charges were eventually dropped. because prosecutors cited insufficient evidence. And years later, Ernestine's death is still unsolved. That became one of the first real turning points in the story. By mid-2005, two women from the same small Louisiana town had been found dead near canals within weeks of each other. The evidence in one case was destroyed by decomposition before anyone got to it. The prosecution had already collapsed, and life in Jennings just kept going. After Ernestine, things went quiet for a bit, not because Jennings suddenly got safer, but because the story just hadn't really come together in public yet. The same drug activity was still running through South Jennings, the same poverty, the same informant culture that people would talk about later as this heavy thing hanging over the town. Life just kept going. People went to work, raised their children, cars kept moving along Interstate 10. But underneath all of that, there was already this feeling, at least for some people, that something in Jennings was seriously wrong. For a while after Ernestine's death, the story just kind of drifted. There were still questions. People in Jennings were still talking. Rumors were still going around, but publicly, there wasn't any sense yet that the parish was dealing with something connected. Then, in 2007, more bodies started appearing. On March 18, 2007, 21-year-old Christine Gary Lopez was found in a canal near Grand Marias. She had been reported missing earlier that month, and just like Loretta, decomposition immediately made everything harder. Reports said they couldn't nail down an exact cause of death because of the condition of the body. Christine was moving through that same South Jennings world as the earlier victims: drugs, survival sex work, unstable housing, the same streets, the same faces. And here is the thing. She was also related to Brittany Gary, who had ended up being one of the youngest victims in the whole case. By this point, people around Jennings were starting to notice that the women dying were not random strangers. Their lives overlapped, sometimes through family, sometimes through addiction, and sometimes through the same social circle sitting at the center of South Jennings. A couple of months after Christine, in May 2007, 26-year-old Whitney Dubois was found in a rural area near Jennings. And here is where it gets even more connected. Whitney had reportedly had a child with a man named Alvin Bootsy Lewis, which tied her right back to Loretta Lewis's family. By this point, the case was no longer feeling like isolated tragedies anymore. These victims were all tied into the same fragile social network, and the similarities between their lives were getting impossible to ignore. 4 women, all connected to the same small community, were found dead within roughly 2 years. Some were found in canals, others near remote roads or rural areas, most of them sharing similar vulnerabilities. And underneath all the growing fears in Jennings, the same problem just kept repeating itself. Uncertain evidence, bodies found in decomposed condition, causes of death difficult to publicly establish. And once that happened, rumors started spreading to fill the gaps nobody could properly explain. Some people believed there was a serial killer walking around the parish. Others thought the answer was buried inside the drug world surrounding South Jennings. And by 2008, it was getting worse. On May 29, 2008, 23-year-old Laconia Brown, known around Jennings as Muggy, was found dead outside town. Then in September, another body, 24-year-old Crystal Shea Benoit Zeno, was found in a rural area of Jefferson Davis Parish. By that point, the atmosphere in Jennings had shifted. People were scared. Families were angry, and local coverage of the deaths was becoming harder to ignore. Then came November 2008. 17-year-old Brittany Gary disappeared after reportedly going to a local shop. Her body was later found in grass near a road on the edge of town. She was the youngest of the 8 women, and by that point, it had gone way past whispers in South Jennings. 7 women from the same parish were dead, and people were demanding answers. That pressure eventually forced a public response. In December 2008, Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff Ricky Edwards announced the formation of a multi-agency task force that involves local, state, and federal investigators. Reportedly, around 14 agencies were involved. For the first time, the investigation looked larger and more coordinated publicly. Around the same time, officials raised the possibility that the same person could be responsible for multiple deaths. That was the moment the serial killer theory really started spreading beyond Louisiana. National media attention started growing, and from the outside, the task force looked like a genuine turning point, like the case was finally being taken seriously. Many people inside Jennings would later look back on that moment very differently. The task force announcement in December 2008 gave a lot of people around Jennings something to hold on to. There were 14 agencies involved, including federal investigators. A sheriff publicly acknowledged that these deaths might actually be connected. From the outside, it looked like the kind of response people had been demanding for years. Then, 8 months later, Nicole Jean Gil-Lorry was dead. On August 19, 2009, Nicole Gil-Lorry was found near Interstate 10 in neighboring Arcadia Parish. She is considered the 8th victim because of her background and her connections to the Jennings network. She was 26 years old. And here is what made her death so crushing. It didn't happen before the task force, not before all the resources came in. It happened after. The investigations was already running. The agencies were already involved. The serial killer theory had already spread across national media. And still, another woman from that same small world around Jennings was dead. For a lot of people in the parish, that is when something broke. Not dramatically, and not in some big public moment. It is more quietly over time, as the months kept dragging on and the cases just stayed stuck. Law enforcement kept putting out statements saying the investigations were ongoing. Tip lines stayed open. Every now and then, there would be appeals for information through the Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's office, but no charges ever came. There were no convictions and no resolutions for any of the 8 women. The longer that silence stretched, the more the people around Jennings stopped asking who was killing these women and started wondering whether this case was ever really going to be solved at all. Because by that point, a lot of people already felt like something inside the investigation was not just right. Rumours had been spreading around Jennings for years already, and once people lose trust in an investigation, it doesn't take long for those rumours to start filling the gaps. The first major controversy to come out publicly centered on Warren Gary, who was the chief criminal investigator at the Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Office. According to later reporting, Gary had bought a pickup truck from an inmate someone who was connected to that same local drug and sex work world that several of the victims had been part of. And that social circle also overlapped with people connected to Christine Lopez, the third victim, and to this local businessman named Frankie Richard, whose name ended up sitting right at the center of a lot of the public speculation around the case. The truck became significant because of what a witness later claimed. According to reports, someone said they had seen Christine Lopez inside that vehicle before her death. By the time that information reached investigators, the truck had reportedly already been cleaned and resold. Whatever it might have held, whatever trace it might have carried, was gone. The fallout led to formal discipline. Warren Gary was fined and removed from the homicide investigation, but he wasn't removed from the Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Office entirely. According to reports, he continued working there afterwards in a position connected to evidence. That detail mattered to people inside Jennings. The question wasn't only about what had been lost with the truck. It was about what it meant that the investigation had remained structurally connected to someone whose conduct had already raised serious questions. Then came a second set of allegations that pushed things further. According to later investigative reporting, 2 female inmates approached a sergeant at the Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Office with a claim about the Lopez case. They alleged that evidence connected to Christine's death had been disposed of at the request of Frankie Richard. They alleged that Richard had prompted officers to get rid of certain items. These were allegations reported through media investigations, not findings established in any court proceedings. No officer had been convicted of homicide in connection with those claims. But according to later reports, the sergeant who took those statements was eventually forced out of his position. And when you put all of that together, the truck bought from an inmate, the witness saying they had seen Christine Lopez inside it, the allegations about evidence being disposed of, and then the sergeant who took those statements later losing his job, it is not hard to understand why people around Jennings started losing trust in the investigation. Because even though none of it ever led to criminal charges against anyone, the damage to public confidence was already done. And once that kind of distrust settles into a town, it usually doesn't just disappear, because by that point, the fear around Jennings had already started changing shape. There was still the original fear that whoever had been killing these women might still be out there. But now something else sat alongside it. The possibility that some of the people responsible for solving these murders had become too entangled in the same world they were supposed to be investigating. As the years passed, the Jeff Davis 8 slowly traveled far beyond Jennings. What had started as local fear and rumor inside one small Louisiana parish was becoming the subject of national reporting, podcasts, documentaries, and serious investigative work. Part of what kept pulling people back to it was that it never resolved into a clean explanation. The longer anyone looked at it, the more complicated it became. At the time, 2 competing theories gradually took shape. The first was the serial killer theory, the framing that entered the mainstream when officials publicly raised the possibility of a common offender in late 2008. Once that language was in the media, coverage increasingly organized itself around it. Multiple women, similar backgrounds, bodies appearing in the same kind of locations over a span of years. A small frightened town, it resembled patterns people recognized from other cases, and it gave reporters and audiences a framework they already understood. And when you look, there was evidence that seemed to back it up. The similarities between the victims were real. The overlapping locations were real. The fact that all these deaths happened within this pretty tight area over a specific stretch of time in a community where the women actually knew each other, that was all real. The serial killer angle wasn't just pulled out of thin air. It made sense based on what people were seeing. But inside Jennings, many people had a different view. And one of the journalists who spent the most time trying to understand why was Ethan Brown. Brown wasn't a reporter who came to Jennings for a week and filled a story. He made repeated trips over several years, reviewing homicide files, sitting with families, speaking with residents who had lived through the fear, and talking to people with connections to law enforcement. His eventual book, Murder in the Bayou, and the Showtime documentary series it inspired, carried the weight of someone who had genuinely tried to understand not just what happened, but how the environment in Jennings had made it possible. Brown's reporting went in a different direction. He was careful about it and made it clear that these were theories, not facts. But his take was that a single serial killer probably didn't explain the whole Jeff Davis 8. The networks in and around South Jennings were just too complex, too entangled for one person to be behind all of it. His reporting pointed toward the possibility of multiple offenders, all connected through that same web of drug dealing, survival sex work, informant relationships, and local power dynamics that had been running that part of the parish for years. That theory was harder to follow than the serial killer narrative. It didn't have a single villain or a clean motive. It described a situation where the line between perpetrators, bystanders, and people in positions of authority had become genuinely difficult to draw, where the women who died had moved through a world where exploitation came from multiple directions, and where accountability was always going to be difficult to establish precisely, because so many different people were implicated in so many different ways. Inside Jennings, that resonated with a lot of people, not just because it made the situation easier to understand, but because it matched what many residents believed they already knew. Over the years, multiple people, some family members of the victims, some residents with no direct connection to the women, described being afraid to say certain things openly. Some alleged that vulnerable women in Jennings had been exploited by local men, including, in some claims, individuals with ties to law enforcement. Others described a community where speaking about what you knew or what you suspected carried real risks. Many of those claims were never verified in court. Some remained at the level of allegation and community belief. But what they reflected was the fear, the sense that certain people were protected, the conviction that something had been deliberately left unsolved became as much a part of the case as the confirmed facts surrounding the deaths themselves. That is the tension the Jeff Davis 8 has never fully escaped. Two explanations sitting side by side, neither provable, neither easily dismissed. One says a predator walked the edges of a vulnerable community and was never caught. The other says the situation was more diffuse and more corrupt, that the women died inside a network where power was being abused in multiple directions, and where the investigations was never equipped to cut through that because too many people had too much to lose. Both remain unsolved, and somewhere between them is where the case has stayed. By the late 2010s, the Jeff Davis 8 case had already remained unsolved for years. The rumors had spread far beyond Louisiana. No one had been convicted, and gradually the story around Jennings started shifting again. Increasingly, the case was not only being discussed as a possible serial murder investigation. More and more, it was being discussed as a story about systemic failure, about whether vulnerable women in Jefferson Davis Parish had been failed not only by individuals, but by institutions that were supposed to protect them. On July 8, 2020, civil rights organizations filed a detailed complaint with the United States Department of Justice under the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act, known as CRIPA, targeting both the Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Office and the Jennings Police Department. The allegations went far beyond the murders themselves. The complaint described what the groups argued were long-standing patterns involving excessive force, racial discrimination, unlawful searches, evidence mishandling, and failures to protect vulnerable people. The Jeff Davis case was referenced repeatedly as part of the broader systemic concerns they believed existed inside the parish. These were civil rights allegations, not criminal findings tied directly to the murders. The complaint did not establish that law enforcement officers killed the women, but for many people following the case, the significance of the filing was what it seemed to represent. The argument that the Jeff Davis investigation could not be separated from the wider culture of distrust and alleged misconduct surrounding parts of the parish itself. But for a lot of people, what mattered about the filing was not just the legal specifics. It was what the complaint seemed to represent. The argument that what happened to these 8 women could not simply be separated from the wider problems people believed had existed around the parish for years. And by that point, Jennings wasn't only carrying the weight of 8 unsolved deaths anymore. It was carrying everything people believed those deaths said about the town, the investigation, and the institutions surrounding both. And as of the time of this recording, the Jeff Davis 8 case still remains unsolved. No one has been convicted of murdering any of the 8 women. Not Loretta, not Ernestine, not Christine, Whitney, Laconia, Crystal, Brittany, or Nicole. Years have passed since the task force was announced. The case has been covered by national media, podcasts, investigative journalists, and a Showtime documentary series. Civil rights complaints have been filed with the Department of Justice. Rumors and theories about what happened around Jennings have spread far beyond Louisiana. And still, nobody has been held accountable for what happened to these women. Officially, the deaths remained classified as unsolved homicides or suspicious deaths. Authorities are yet to publicly confirm whether all 8 cases were connected or who may have been responsible for any of them. The tip lines connected to the Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Office are still active. Investigators still periodically ask for information, and people still revisit this case, hoping that eventually someone will finally explain what really happened around Jennings between 2005 and 2009. But for the families, they are still waiting for justice. This is Criminal Cadence. Please like and subscribe. Let us know your thoughts in the comments.